You're watching The Way to Salvation, a look into Messianic prophecy and salvation with Rabbi Pastor LaRue.
Shalom, and thank you for joining us on Hebraic Perspectives and for our new series, The Way to Salvation. Okay, now in this series, we'll be examining the subject of Messianic Christology, which basically deals with the Messianic prophecies found in the writings of what we call is the Hebrew Tanakh, or that is the Hebrew Scriptures here. We'll also be answering and addressing questions and things like, what is salvation? Why do we need salvation? Are we really sinners? Our need for a Messiah? Who is the true Messiah? Has the Messiah come yet? Did or has the Messiah fulfilled Messianic prophecy here? And what do the rabbis and the Jewish sages and the Jewish community all say and think about all these things and these matters concerning who? Well, concerning this Jewish Messiah. Now, beginning with our first question on salvation, and that is, what is the meaning of salvation? Well, our first order of business begins with the theological issue of a word we call is soteriology, which deals with the issue of what? Well, the issue of salvation. Now, looking back into the Hebrew Scriptures, the idea here, okay, the idea and the concept and meaning of salvation to a Hebrew person meant to live or be in a state of full deliverance from harm, enemies, and consequences of sin and judgment under what is known or is called the Torah here. But if you lived out and you obeyed all of this and all of these Torah laws of God, according to Deuteronomy here, chapter 28 and chapter 30, God's promises in return was to give them the blessings, continued deliverance, peace, safety, and physical salvation, which kept the people and its nation living in a state of peace, as reminded from where? Well, going back to the Torah again. This is in Devarim 7, chapter 7, verse 12, verses 23 and 24, and Devarim 8, 7, and 19, and then in Tehillim, this is Psalms 33:12 here. Now, the idea and concept of salvation and deliverance from judgment was not focused on having spiritual salvation from judgment at that time here. Having salvation for them meant being delivered and saved physically, nationally, and covenantal. As that was the same view of first century Israel when Yeshua was present. They expected this same kind of salvation but missed the spiritual concept of salvation. Now, we'll discuss more details on this issue in our upcoming videos, okay? But in those times, all right, in those times, if you as a nation and a people became disobedient to God's law under the Torah, you would be subject and face severe judgment and at times even be expelled or excommunicated out of the promised land and separated from God's care, as we learn this from the Torah and Devarim again, Deuteronomy 31, 17 to 18, and then we see something else in Deuteronomy 32, 20. We see something in Yeshayahu, and that is Isaiah 59, 2. We see that in Micah 3, 4, and Ezekiel 39, 23, and 24 all speak of this matter in question. So salvation and deliverance had its meaning in being saved by obedience to what? Well, obedience to the law here. And this was a constant problem for the people of Israel, as biblical history showed us that Israel had habitually broke this Mosaic covenant with God many times and throughout many generations here. And so the need for a new covenant with a new spiritual salvation and deliverance was later announced and was given by the Nevi'im, or that is the prophets, as learned in Yirmiyahu, and this is Jeremiah 31 through 34. And this is what it says to us, starting with verse 31 here. It says, Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a brit hadashah, when I'll make a new covenant with the house of Yisrael, and with the house of Yehuda, Judah, verse 32, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, though I was a husband to them, says the Lord, verse 33, but this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Yisrael. After those days, says Adonai the Lord, I will put my Torah, put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Verse 34, no more shall every man teach his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord. For they all shall know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, says Adonai the Lord here. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more. Okay, so this is the meaning, all right? This is the meaning and concept of what salvation was and what it meant under the Mosaic covenant. But now we need to understand our next question here, and that is, why, okay, why do we need salvation? Well, again, going back to the first book of the Torah in Bereshit, Genesis 2:17, we're told right from the beginning that the first created human beings by God were given one commandment to never eat of the tree of knowledge of good and of evil here. And then we see in Genesis 3:2 and 24, that man had chosen to do what? Well, he chose to disobey God's command, and as a consequence for their disobedience, they were what? Well, they were judged, and they were what? They were separated from the presence of God, severing the covenant relationship between God and man because of what? Well, because of their choice to sin. But in Bereshit here, okay, in Genesis 3:15, we then find the very first mention of a Messianic promise here, which, by the way, this Messianic prophecy, these speak and teach us all about the Messiah's purpose, his coming, and future ruling upon the earth in the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, when we see Messianic prophecies throughout the Tanakh, or that is the Hebrew Scriptures, we are to know that they speak to us here, okay? They speak to us, and they direct us to who? They direct us to the promised Messiah of Yisrael here, of Israel here, okay? Now, getting back to Bereshit 3:15, it explains that even though man had sinned and violated God's commandment and had broken covenant with him, God would not forsake them ultimately. Instead, what we find here is that God now presents and offers to remedy the situation by the promise of a special seed here who would be sent by God through what? Well, through the human race here, okay? And then who would then come in the future time and would spiritually do what? Well, he would spiritually restore and he would reconcile man back to God in a special way. Now, this promised seed mentioned in this Messianic prophecy of Bereshit, Genesis 3:15, is the one we recognize as being the one true Messiah here, who is known as the chosen one of God, as the Hebrew word for Mashiach, okay? The Hebrew word for Mashiach here means the anointed one, which is a person consecrated for a specific and a holy purpose here, okay? But now, our next question that arises is by what means here, okay? By what means and how would this new coming Messiah or anointed one reconcile and restore man back to covenant relationship with God here? Which, by the way, our Hebrew word for covenant here is the word we call brit, which signifies a solemn binding agreement. It is a treaty or a pledge between two parties, often initiated by who? Well, that's God. Now, this word is also derived from the Hebrew roots related to the word cutting. It traditionally implies a covenant sealed by passing between divided pieces of animal sacrifice. So, what we learn from Adam and Eve's covenant here, called the Adamic covenant, is that it was based on one commandment. And that one commandment said not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and of evil here. Now, because they broke this covenant, one of the main consequences was automatic what? Well, it was automatic separation from God's presence, along with what is found again in Bereshit, Genesis 3:16 to 24. Until what? Well, until the remedy for their disobedience and sin would be provided. But now we ask, okay, here, why didn't, okay, why didn't God forgive them when they sinned? I know a lot of people probably have that question out there. Well, the answer to this is that God indeed would forgive, and would not only forgive, but he would remove all sin from man once and for all. And we'll begin to see more of the meaning and development of this coming in a number of Messianic prophecies in our series here, which we will reveal how this promised seed of Genesis 3:15 removes man's sins, restores covenant and relationship between God and man. Now, the rabbis in Judaism here often disagree and they protest here on this sin issue by stating what? Well, they state that Adam and Eve died and their judgment died with them. It did not or was not passed down to all generations of man. But I do believe that if the rabbis here, okay, if the rabbis and Judaism were right about this point, why do people die? Okay, why do women continue having pains during childbirth here? Why are men striving and laboring hard just to make a living? Now, these are the ongoing consequences until the promised seed changes and removes that judgment from man. And we'll find out more about that in the prophecies we see coming in our next videos. Okay, so now let's get into our next question here. And that is, are we all sinners? The answer to this, of course, is yes. But why are we sinners? Well, as we know from scriptures, since the beginning, the human family on earth sinned. And so now after that, all born into the world are now born into and with a sin nature. We call this original sin. Now man is fallen from his state of obedience and perfection and has taken on the nature of sin, not perfection as he once was created. It is the consequence which was passed down by our Adamic family here. A person does not need, once more, a person does not need to commit a sin to become a sinner. The scriptures again teach us that we share, or that we are all born with the same fallen nature as who? Well, the same fallen nature of Adam and Eve. As seen from where? Well, we find a reference in the Brit Hadashah. That is Romans 5:12 here. We all are prone to sin throughout our lifetime. And that again is because we all have a carnal nature which is subject to committing sin, and man's carnal nature is no longer perfect because of that sin, okay? So as we're shown this from the book of James 1:14 and 15, this is what it says to us, starting with verse 14. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed, verse 15. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, does what? Well, it brings forth death. King David in the Hebrew scriptures, he also realized this by saying in Tehillim, or that is in Psalms 51:5. This is what he said, starting with verse 5. He said, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity here, and in sin my mother," what? "My mother conceived me." And so there you have it. We all are born to the sin nature. Until we receive what? Well, until we receive the sin remedy here. Now, even though the rabbis and Judaism fundamentally rejects the doctrine of original sin, holding that individuals are born pure, they're born innocent, and are free of inherited sin, they claim humans possess free will to choose between good and evil rather than being inherently tainted, and they are responsible solely for their own actions. But apparently Judaism and the rabbis have overlooked and have missed what the Torah plainly said from Bereshit, Genesis 3, 6, and 5, as it clearly states this. Starting with verse 5. "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in Eretz, the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." And then in the Ketuvim, or that is in the writings of Tehillim, and that is in Psalms 14, 1 and 3, we're told this. Verse 1. "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none who does good." Verse 2. "The Lord looks down," Adonai, the Lord, looks down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek God. Verse 3. "They have all turned aside. They have together become corrupt. There is none," there is none who does good. No, not one. And finally, we have a reminder from the Apostle Rabbi Paul the Apostle, who told us this from Romans 3:23 by saying in verse 23, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of Adonai the Lord." So the scriptures here are completely clear-cut and to the point that we all are inherently what? Well, we're all inherently sinful, and that we all are inherently born with a nature to do what? To sin here. And no matter what the rabbis say and Judaism supposes, God's Torah and the Brit Hadashah is clear on this issue. But now moving on, we'll begin to open up our next set of questions in our next episode. And there we will begin to unpack and then understand and deal with the remedy for what? Well, for man's sins here. We'll get into the discussion and more in detail in our next episode, as we'll answer our next question is our need for a Messiah, the remedy. So please be sure and join us in our Part 2 series of The Way to Salvation. I'm Pastor Rabbi LaRue. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you again.
You've been watching The Way to Salvation with Pastor Rabbi LaRue. Be sure and join us for our continued videos on this series. Shalom.